We need to reconvene. Andrew, we just circulated a memo that the staff prepared. Andrew, you want to introduce it?
So there's been a lot of discussion about the fuel cost component in the price index because of its decline, the largest decline we have ever seen in it, of 41% decline in fuel costs. So the question was asked by one of the board members last week, like how does that compare if we line it up with the RPIE, the same component? So what we did was we took a 15-year period to take a look at exactly what's going on. Since we actually have fuel price data for all these years, we readjusted the component for a calendar year, which is actually the RPIE data is on a calendar year. So we were able to go back, for example, and match up 2014 prices with 2014 fuel costs that were reported. We can't do that with every component of the price index, but we're lucky to be able to do that with this component. The weighting stays a little different in that we have to take sort of 3/4 of one year and 1/4 of another to establish the item weights and the component weights, but it's much closer as it aligns. And previous to 2015, when we decided that we're not comparing apples to apples, we're doing apples and oranges, the fuel component in the I&E was all fuel related, heating for gas, fuel oil, steam. Prior to that, that wasn't happening in the fuel component for the price index. So what we did was we said, okay, let's match that as well. So not only are we matching the prices, but now the components have the same items in both. Whereas before the fuel component was just fuel oil in the price index, now everything's matched over these 15-year period. So essentially what we found is, if you look on page 2, there's a table there. So you can take a different looks at different years and see where we were close or not close, or the difference between the fuel component for the price index versus the I&E fuel component. So over the course of those 15 years, the cumulative change from 2000 to 2014 was 292%. For the PISE component, whereas the I&E component it grew less at a rate of 229%. That's somewhat as a result of overestimating costs when there were spikes in fuel oil and overestimating the declines when there was declines. So what we can never do in the price index, we can measure consumption by heating degree days, but we can never be able to measure buying patterns of owners, especially when it comes to fuel oil. There's a monthly bill for gas that they do every month. We're pretty good at calculating that, but fuel oil could be purchased in one month and not in another month, for example. So there's different rates that they could be charging because they have economy of scale. So they may get a lower discounted price one year, and if fuel costs drop again, then the drop in their costs may not be the same as what we're measuring. We can never measure that in the price index. So that's where we're accounting for those differences, because those expenditure patterns are not something we can capture. So I think we can safely say that in years that we've overestimated costs over time, in years where it's gone up, and when years it's declined, we've overestimated that decline. To the extent that paragraph, the large paragraph above the table, so if we just looked at the years where we say fuel costs went up, in the price index, the annualized average is 25.6% a year over that time period, and the I&E showed an increase of 19%. So we were overestimating in that time period, just the average for those years. I think there's 7 years where there were, no, 8 years where there were increases, I believe. Something, well, 8 or 9 there were increases. In the other years where we saw there was a decline, our annual average decrease was 10.8% in the price index and 6.1% in the I&E. So what we thought all along is, and that's sort of this analysis bears it out, and I think it's the best we've done because we've actually matched the time periods in the data. So I think that goes away to answering the question, and going, oh, I'm sorry.
I don't understand, like, look at 2003. You said the high fuel consumption, you estimated 45.3%, but it was 50%?
Yeah, the I&E component, actually, they said that fuel rose 50% that year.
And the same thing with 2012, you estimated a negative 11%, and it was actually almost 15%? 2002?
Oh, 2002. Yeah, so those are the 2 year, yeah, so in some years, the difference was on the,
You underestimated.
yeah, in those years, but in general, over the course of that time, if you take all the declines in a particular area, I mean, if you can go to, most recently, 2012, it was the opposite. We said it went down 15.3, and actually, in the I&E, it says 7.3. So, and just before you go on, so then just to answer to the idea of, well, what happened in 2014, if we take out those 3 months in 2015, we actually saw a rise in fuel costs of 3.4% as the I&E rose 1.5%. So those 3 months make a huge, obviously this time made a huge difference because that's when the real declines occurred. So for this particular price, for that particular year and that price index where we said fuel oil costs went down 20%, it was really those 3 months that was a huge thing. Now, I anticipate next year that we'll see a decline in fuel costs from on the RPIE side because then it's syncing up, and that should be the case. But as this data shows, will it be as much as, over time, we've overestimated the declines, and we've overestimated the increases.
If you're, and I agree with you that the I&E fuel next year will go down, the HIAC will go up, the delta will be larger. And it's really the delta that we're really concerned about, because what about these outliers?
Yeah, I mean, it's I would think, take a look at you sort of have to take the data over time and see what we're doing with it. And, in any particular year, it's tough to say that, what's going on with those outliers. I mean,
There's a big difference in 2000 and 2011.
yeah. And that was a large, I think not always, but again, there are other factors going on there. You're still in a recession. Maybe there's some less spending on owners' parts. There's other factors. Again, we can never measure expenditure patterns by owners in the price index.
Do you
So.
know what 2009 is, like, the kind of like economic downturn? That's why you estimated a negative 16 and it's a negative 20.
Yeah, and they're not estimates. So those are actual price changes. Again, one's price and one's expenditures. Owner-reported cost data. So.
In that year, it was 20%.
What percentage of the higher occupancy?
Oh, about 12%. And that's not to say with, the overall accumulative change that's going to put the price index wrong for that year, because there could be other components that don't match up. Just because it's off, I'd have to go back and look, but like in 2005, where there's a big disparity, it doesn't necessarily mean the total price index was that far off. It wasn't, so. And then the last page, we just graph those, so you can see it, make it a little easier to see. But I hope that brings some clarity to it.
Thank you for doing it.
So, I know it was a big issue.
I mean, it seems like it's maybe the, we're talking about like a 4% variability in the pile.
When it comes to declines, yeah, let's,
Or even, I mean, both, the variability on.
yeah, I guess on the other end, yeah.
25 and 50%, right? It's 25 on the.
25 points, yeah, it's about 6.5% on the other side. It's more like 4, yeah.
Yeah, so you split the difference, you know, you're saying kind of, you know, a 35% variability, something like that, on the 12% cost.
Of the costs.
It's like a 4% variability on the index overall.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah,
Right, yeah.
over that time period.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which, I mean,
You think we're in the margin of error?
you know, I'm saying it's.
Yeah, I guess that's one way to look in the margin error, like a poll,
It
right?
doesn't feel to me like it makes a huge swing, you know, when you consider, even if that 12%, you know, looks like it, you know, it's somewhere between either 45% down or whatever, 40% down or 45% up, depending on the swing.
Yeah, I guess you could look at it that way. All right.
Can we go back to that earlier conversation? I know we're
Here, and when we want to get to them, but just on this, on the data gathering, is there any way to kind of do sampling? Can we get DOF like actual information, like could we do a random sampling and get an audited financials for some property owners, and then we could have actual information? Because otherwise, you know, I mean, obviously opening the books makes a big difference, because if someone who actually had real information, we would know what the income and expenses are. We can only guesstimate, you know, like we can say the cost of operating a building in New York City is $800 a month for an apartment, but that's, you know, that's data that we can gather through certain sources. But if there's random sampling information, that might be much more reliable data across neighborhoods around the city.
You know, short of us doing a survey about owners, whether they fill it out, I mean, we don't have any authority to audit owners. We can't make them fill out a survey. I mean, we've sent surveys to them before, and, I mean, I still need to have a discussion with finance. You know, maybe they can, in the off-season, we could figure that out and see whether they'd be willing to be able to do some sort of audit again, but it wouldn't be an annual audit, I don't believe. It would have to be, you know, then we're asking them to do it each year. That,
I mean, even if finance did it once a decade or every 5 years, we'd have some information, whether it's more reliable than the data we have now. At least it'd be some level of concrete information.
I still need to have a conversation with them about it, so we'll see.
And just to add to that, I mean, I think it would be good for all of us as a board if, you know, if there's a way to, in the off-season, to follow up on some of these questions of improvements to the data, you know, getting more granular actual information from the buildings, you know, that I think that would be good. I think some of the discussions we were having this morning about sort of what are some of the capital expenses that may or may not be reflected in the reports we're getting, but also what are some of the other income streams that are not reflected in the briefings that we sort of just surface in our conversation. But, you know, these are heavier lifts. I recognize that. So, you know, we have a compressed schedule, but I think, you know, at least we would love to continue this thread of conversation maybe in the off season and think about, you know, what's an efficient way to at least get some hard numbers on all of these things, that so that we're not sort of constantly trying to guess at the, you know, what's in the shadows.
All right, thank you. So I think we're ready to proceed with the testimony of apartment tenants. And we're expecting to hear from Barika Williams, Association for Neighborhood and Housing Development, Tom Waters, Housing Policy Analyst with Community Service Society, Jenny Laurie, Executive Director at Housing Court Answers, and Tim Collins, partner Collins, Dobkins, and Miller. Shall we start with Ms. Williams?
Should we just have the panelists come up? You would-
Or all
Yeah.
four of you can come up? That's fine as well.
Thanks, Wasim. Thanks. We just thought maybe Jenny could start since she's...
Okay. My name is Jenny Corey. I'm the Executive Director of Housing Court Answers. Housing Court Answers is a nonprofit founded in 1981. Thank you. That's better. We run the information tables in the city's housing courts. We provide assistance to unrepresented litigants in housing court in the 5 county housing courts, plus in the Harlem Community Justice Center. We also provide assistance to unrepresented tenants at 250 Broadway and at 851 Grand Concourse, and NYCHA tenants who are in those venues. We serve about 40,000. We see about 40,000 people a year in the at our housing court tables, and we talk to another 5, 6, 7,000 people a year over our hotline. Our hotline is a feature of the Emergency Rent Coalition and is funded by the United Way to provide assistance to tenants facing eviction in housing court who need assistance with back rent. Being a tenant in New York City is no picnic, as you know, and life is particularly rough for those who can barely afford their rent and for those who face eviction. The research recently done by Matthew Desmond, the Harvard sociologist and author of the bestseller Evicted, supports other studies done in New York, showing that people who get evicted don't do well after they've been evicted. Most either enter the shelter system, or more commonly, they move into housing that's more expensive, less stable, and in worse repair than the apartment they lost. There is currently a crisis of evictions in New York City, and there is unprecedented support for the right to counsel for tenants without lawyers facing eviction. Advocates are pushing legislation that would require the city to provide an attorney to tenants living at 200% of poverty or less and who face eviction or foreclosure. The movement is partially fueled by a crisis in housing affordability in the city. In 2015, close to 22,000 households were evicted by city marshals. Countless other thousands left before the marshal was engaged. Over 200,000 tenants were taken to housing court or sued in housing court for non-payment of rent last year. While the numbers are high, they have been dropping recently over the last couple of years, and we saw an 18% drop in marshal evictions comparing 2015 to 2014. We assume that this is due to a number of factors, including the city's recent efforts to prevent evictions, both by providing attorneys, by providing more eviction prevention services, and perhaps an improving economy. The eviction numbers citywide were lower in 2015 than in 2014. However, the numbers were higher for neighborhoods with high displacement pressures. We hear a lot of complaints at our tables about the use of preferential rents in these neighborhoods for rent-stabilized tenants, so we assume that that plays into some of the affordability crises that lead to evictions. In Harlem, for example, while filings were down in Manhattan, in Harlem, they were up by 34%, and warrants issued were up by 20%. The warrant issued is the end of a housing court proceeding, for those of you who are unfamiliar. It's the last step before the marshal puts the family out. So that number is an important indicator of what's going on in housing court. The trend citywide continues to be better, good. For the first 2 terms of this year, January and February, non-payment filings continued to go down compared to last year. There were 32,408 non-payment filings in 2016 compared to close to 35,000 filings in the first 2 months of last year, a 7% drop. There was a 26% drop in calendar non-payments over the same periods, and however, there was a small increase in judgments and warrants. Warrants were up by 12% in the first 2 months of this year compared to last year. The biggest increases in issuance of judgments and warrants was in Bronx and the Brooklyn, the two counties with the highest numbers of cases overall in housing court and the highest number of, or the worst affordability crises. The de Blasio administration is highly motivated to reduce homeless numbers, and part of that is an unprecedented expansion of tools to prevent evictions. The city has increased eviction prevention funding tenfold to $60 million for this fiscal year. This has been combined with the state courts added financing for civil legal services statewide. The administration has also contributed enormously to the reduction in evictions by improvements at HRA and DHS, the Human Resources Administration, and the Department of Homeless Services. One of the things that the city has done is streamline the process for tenants who are in an eviction crisis, who are applying either for ongoing public assistance, applying for a program called FEPS, or applying for rent arrears grants. Those are three really, the city has really three critical tools for preventing evictions. So I think that's why last year you saw the drop, not such a huge drop in the filings numbers, but a much bigger drop in the numbers of people who are actually evicted. We think that part of these eviction prevention programs are sort of kicking the can down the road because there's still a crisis of affordability, and without those sort of emergency interventions, there would be a lot more people facing eviction in housing court. A recent independent budget office study found that over a 10-year period, applicants at PATH, that's the place where families that have been evicted and are trying to enter the shelter system apply for shelter, that 40% of them came from rent-regulated apartments, and of those families, a third left their apartments because of an eviction. Through our hotline, we take calls from tenants who are applying for charitable assistance with back rent. So these are tenants who have applied to HRA and are referred to us for an application or a referral to a private charity. We do referrals to places like Catholic Charities, the Bridge Fund, and some other organizations that receive city and private funding to prevent evictions. And when we do these applications, we take a lot of information from the tenants. We do an intake, and we keep that information in a database, obviously. And we, last year, for those who knew what their housing status was, 68% were rent stabilized, which is a huge portion of the people who are in housing court. Of those, about 10% had a subsidy, and so were not in an eviction case because they couldn't afford their rent. That's not completely true. Certainly if they had Section 8, that wasn't the cause. If they had DRE or SCRE, it might have been the cause. The median take-home income of the people who called us was $26,400 a year, and the median rent was $1,250. Obviously, an unaffordable rent. If you look at a family that's income is $26,400 and a rent of $1,250, it's about 60% of their income for rent. Over 80% of the callers had one or two events that put them into a housing crisis. That could have been the loss of a job or the reduction of their hours, or a health crisis. Those were the three main things that we found, and that shows to us that there's a very thin cushion between their income and their rent. These people don't have other resources to prevent them from being taken to housing court. We see rent stabilization as a key tool in preventing evictions in New York City for two reasons. One, if the tenant can pay the rent, they can stay, unlike tenants, obviously, in unregulated housing where they don't have any tenure rights or right to a lease renewal. And the other is, of course, is the power that you have, which is to moderate rent increases. And I would urge the Rent Guidelines Board members to keep that in mind as you're setting guidelines. Keep in mind the crisis of affordability and the crisis of evictions in New York City. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, there we go. Thanks. I'm Tom Waters with the Community Service Society, and we're a large, very old nonprofit anti-poverty agency that has a lot of different programs and functions, including a little think tank that studies the conditions that low-income New Yorkers are experiencing in the housing market, the labor market, the education system, and so on. And I really want to thank you for this opportunity to comment on an issue that's incredibly important to CSS's agenda, because rent regulation is the most important source of housing for low-income New Yorkers, which we define as people with incomes up to twice the poverty line. More low-income New Yorkers live in rent-regulated housing than in public housing, plus privately owned subsidized housing, plus those with vouchers. It's a very big part of the picture for low-income New Yorkers. And rent-regulated tenants are really spread among the bottom 80% of the income spectrum, but that includes a big fat bulge in the low-income part. Rent regulation is not, strictly speaking, an affordability program, but it does provide a significant improvement in affordability alongside the other important rights that it provides for low-income tenants. It's not nearly as good as having a Section 8 voucher or a Mitchell-Lama apartment or something like that, but it does low-income rent-regulated tenants are paying a lower share of their income in rent than unregulated tenants, and that really matters. I also want to thank you for the change in direction that the board has taken in the past couple years, when it's been clear that rent guidelines have been based on consideration of both landlords' financial position and that of tenants. That's a change in direction from the Bloomberg years, and it's important. You've set guidelines that are sort of in between what you would do if you were trying to hold things constant for tenants and hold things constant for landlords, and that's really what I think the law mandates that you do. So I want to thank you and encourage you to keep up that policy. This year, the economic recovery has taken a very long time, but a lot of experts are saying, we've recovered now. The unemployment rate fell to 5.5% this year, which is sort of in the normal range, although higher than it was back in the good old days. That took a really long time coming, and unfortunately, so far we don't have evidence that it's translating into really higher incomes for low-income New Yorkers. In my written testimony, you'll see on page 2, figure 2 shows the change in inflation-adjusted income for 5 equal sectors of the city, the lowest 20% in income, the 20th to 40th percentiles, and so on up. And what it shows is that the top 20% has recovered, and the second 20% has recovered a bit, but incomes for the bottom 60% are still more like the 2002 than like they were prior to the crash in 2008. So incomes have not recovered in the most recent income data that we have to work with. On the other hand, as you already know, rents went up both before, during, and after the crisis, and so low-income tenants have 2002 incomes, but they're not paying 2002 rents, and that is a huge source of hardship. So like we always do, we look at rent burdens, the share of income paid as rent for low-income New Yorkers. That's on page 6. I'm skipping a couple of graphs. Figure 6 on page 6. What it shows is that during the boom period before the crash, from 2005 to 2008, rent burdens went way up for low-income New Yorkers. They started paying a higher share of their income in rent than before. That's because incomes were actually going up then, but rents went up faster. What's happened since then is that they've stayed high for the most part, especially for regulated tenants. things got worse, and then they stayed bad. That's the pattern. If we also look at residual income, this is the share of income, this is the amount, the absolute amount of income available for all purposes except rent, so it's income minus rent divided by the number of people in the household. As you would expect based on the rent burden analysis, residual income went way down, so households had, in inflation-adjusted dollars, less to spend per person as a result of the increasing rent burdens, quite a bit less for rent-regulated low-income tenants overall, 7% less in 2014 than in 2005. So that's, that's a 7% hit to the standard of living for low-income New Yorkers, very substantial, and the story is it went down and then it stayed bad. So as of 2014, the recovery in employment had not yet turned into any recovery in incomes or in the ability to afford rent for low-income New Yorkers. I'll also add something new to our testimony this year, which is a look at overcrowding in low-income households. We testified about this a year ago based on the preliminary results from the New York City Housing Vacancy Survey that were available then. It was striking, even looking at the entire population of rent-regulated tenants of all income levels, that crowding increased. Since then, the New York City Comptroller's Office has done a study of crowding showing that crowding increased, but what hasn't been done so far and that I wanted to add was to distinguish crowding among low-income tenants from higher-income tenants, crowding among people who lack a housing subsidy versus those who have a subsidy. And I also looked at regulated versus unregulated tenants. And the story is that crowding got worse for low-income tenants without a subsidy, whether they were regulated or not. There's almost no difference in the pattern. And crowding stayed the same for tenants who either had higher incomes or who had a subsidy. So subsidies protected people against an increase in crowding. Rent regulation did not. Approximately the same picture is seen if you look at severe crowding. Crowding means more than one person per room. So a household of 4 people living in an apartment with 3 rooms is crowded. If a household of 3 people living in an apartment of 3 rooms is not crowded. That's the standard being used here. Severe crowding means 1.5 people per room. So crowding really got worse for this one particular group of people, a lot worse. I mean, there was like 24,000 or so more crowded low-income households in New York because of this change than there were before. A substantial increase. And it's a real hardship. We know from public health or education research that children in crowded households do less well in school, which is attributed to the lack of a quiet place to do your homework and a quiet place to sleep at night. And it's quite a measurable effect there. Also, Jenny already mentioned Matthew Desmond's book, Evicted, which maybe you're tired of the hype about this book, but it actually hasn't been hyped enough. It's incredibly good, and everyone should read it. He really dramatizes the kind of emotional stress that comes from households who are doubling up in order to afford rent. And I'm 99% sure the reason for this increase in crowding is households doubling up or else taking on another person, Uncle Joe or whatever, joining the household in order to make the rent more affordable. So it harms households in terms of educational opportunities, in terms of educational attainment, achievement, and in terms of emotional stress. It's also a well-known harbinger of homelessness, right? It's being doubled up is part of the pathway to homelessness, and that's even more alarming than the the harm that it does is the signal of the harm to come. So it should be taken extremely seriously as a sign of intensifying pressure on tenants that there was such a substantial increase in crowding among this group of people. So the conclusion that I hope that you'll draw from this is that in spite of the good work you've done the past 2 years, tenants are still under a great deal of pressure. Maybe things have gotten better since 2014 slightly, but I'm sure it's not very much. The fact that the recovery hadn't really helped by 2014 is a very troubling sign. Tenants don't have any slack to give up to help landlords with. The fact that your staff's research shows that, or forecasts that landlords' operating costs are going down, should be combined with the fact that tenants' situation has not gotten any better to lead you to pass a modest rent rollback or a rent freeze. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Barika Williams. I'm the Deputy Director for the Association for Neighborhood and Housing Development, and welcome to all the new members. It's nice to see new faces. So I'm just going to touch a little bit on the affordability piece, but sort of skip a lot of that since my colleagues have sort of already spoken to some of that. I just want to add in a couple of specific numbers. Actually, my envelope was missing my color charts, so I will email those over to you. I know there's a lot of information in HVS that has not been crunched yet into data tables that we're used to having, and so we pulled some of that information so you all would have it and be able to compare the data tables that you've had in the past for HVS 2011 with the new HVS 2014 housing vacancy survey, numbers, and have those as well. So I'll get those over to you all. I just wanted to highlight a couple of affordability pieces specifically, which is that the median, let's see, I'm pulling it up. The median contract rent for rent-stabilized units increased from 2011 to 2014 by 6.3%, and this was in comparison to just a 5.3% increase in private non-regulated units. So actually the stabilized stock saw a higher contract rent increase than the private non-regulated stock, which I think is an important number to sort of point out. And this is despite the fact that obviously many of the rent-stabilized units have an average income that is lower than sort of the broader private rental market population. The other thing that I would sort of illustrate in this is keeping in mind the scale. Both the other speakers have talked a lot about low income, and I think it's easy to sort of to get confused or think about what that means in terms of New York City's population. About a third of New York City earns below $44,000, which would mean that they could afford at the most, on the high end of that, $1,200 to $1,000 unit rent and not be rent burdened. And between 2011 and 2014, we lost 17% of those units citywide. So we are shedding those units, and it continues to be a very large core chunk of our citywide population. So I just add those numbers in. To talk a little bit from a different angle, ANHD is a membership organization. We've been around for about 40 years. ANHD has 100 nonprofit neighborhood-based members across New York City, and we're here, and our members work to see that there are flourishing neighborhoods with decent, safe, and affordable housing. Our membership has built over 100 units of affordable housing over the past 25 years alone, and so I am specifically going to speak to how a developer, how nonprofit developers sort of tackle this challenge of maintaining affordability for their tenants who, in the case of our membership, are also their neighbors and their residents, and still maintain and manage safe and affordable buildings, right? So I want to point out that our membership operate 100% affordable buildings. They do this under standard market conditions. They don't get any ongoing operating subsidy, absent sort of Section 8 that any other building could potentially have. So this is them doing this under the same market principles as a for-profit building does, but they do so without being able to draw on, pull from the revenues and pull between buildings that a for-profit building can necessarily do, right? So they have, many of their programs are funded in their building has to be self-sustainable. Other pieces that they operate are sort of nonprofit programs, but there's not a lot of space to sort of draw on profit and pump into other pieces and other things. And yet despite this, our members manage to make needed repairs, maintain buildings, upkeep their buildings and their units, all while assuring safe and sustainable building finances, and specifically and with the very clear mission and intention of not burdening their tenants as much as possible. I'm going to speak to specifically some programs that are available, and I want to point out that all of the programs that I'm going to talk about are available both to nonprofit and to for-profit buildings. And so these are some of the ways that our membership says we have a building expense, something is happening, we need to do a repair, we need to do improvements. How can we mitigate the cost of this being passed on to our tenants as increased rent? And there's actually a number of these programs across the city. They're available for sort of the smaller developer to the largest developer. Our membership ranges from folks who operate just a couple of buildings to organizations that have portfolios of over 1,500 units. So they really range and they take advantage of this in different ways. Some of these programs include HPD's Article 8A loan program, which provides rehabilitation loans for the upgrading or replacement of major building systems with an emphasis on energy efficiency. So this is a way to bring in new energy efficiency, things like boilers and AC systems and things like that. The participation loan program provides city capital or federal home funds combined with bank financing, and this is for a private lender to provide like a low 1% interest loan or funds, and that's so that buildings can have substantial rehabilitation of building systems, structural improvements, modernization of apartment interiors. So also another piece of that is that's specific to interiors of apartments. One of the things we often have heard over the course of time is that there's not a way to get support for individual apartment improvements, and this is actually one of the cases where you can access funds to support the interior of a building, not necessarily the systems or the sort of overall building infrastructure. Similarly, the Small Buildings Loan Program provides those same type of sources for moderate to full-on gut rehab of buildings, but for smaller buildings. This is for buildings that have 1 to 20 units. So this is specifically to say smaller buildings have different challenges than somebody who's got 100 units and is doing a very big, very substantial project. And it's a way for them to then be able to access similar resources. And the Small Owner Repair Program, so RP, provides 10-year forgivable loan for limited systems replacement and other key repairs for small building owners for 3 to 20 unit buildings. So these are some of the different pieces. And of course, the last one, which most of you are probably familiar with, is the J51 program, which provides a 34-year to 14-year exemption from the increase in real estate taxes that result from rehabilitation work on the building, so that rehabbing and improving your building isn't also accompanied with a big tax increase, which actually I think speaks specifically to some of the pieces that was in the income and expense studies, showing that one of the biggest increases in cost in this year was taxes, and so that would focus on sort of thinking about how many of the buildings surveyed were actually taking advantage of J51, and thinking about how many of them should additionally be considering that as a way of mitigating some of their tax cost. So the point is that all of these programs allow for-profit and nonprofit landlords to improve, address changing conditions, address modifications that are necessary, and ensure safe buildings in a way that they don't have to pass on the full cost to tenants, so that tenants aren't taking on the full burden of a building's infrastructure increase in what ends up being a huge increase in their rent. I know you all have heard, I'm sure, the different PIOC numbers and the changes. I mean, we'd like to applaud the RGB and the RGB staff for sort of updating how these numbers were weighted, which they did in 2015. It's still, the PIOC in comparison to the RPIE, the income and expenses, still show that there's a drastic difference in actual income and expenses and in how the PIOC has increased. So going from 1990 to the current moment in time, it's about a 20% gap in what rent would have changed based on the PIOC increases in comparison to the income expenses. So if you had a $600 rent in 1990, that would mean that you were paying $1,706 in 2014 based on the PIOC, which is in comparison to a $600 rent increasing to only $1,500, $1,588 with income and expenses. So it's a $120 gap per month, but it shakes out to a $1,400 gap over the year. And while on some hands that might seem insignificant, actually the Urban Institute just released a study this morning, today, that indicated that households having a savings of between $250 and $750 in the bank, which is exactly where this range is the difference between a family being able to sustain a cost and not be evicted and not, right? So when families don't have that money in the bank, when something happens, they just can't absorb those outside circumstances, and so they end up leading to eviction, whereas having those $250, $750, which, right, this $1,400 extra over time would be the difference between a family being able to sustain something like that. So thank you. I'll pass it along to Tom.
Thank you.